Hiking had always been my escape. Whether it was a stressful work week or just a desire to disconnect from the world, there was nothing quite like the crunch of boots on dirt, the smell of pine in the air, and the expansive views that made all my worries seem so small. That's why I decided to take a weekend trip to a trail I'd never explored before, deep in the mountainous region of northern Vermont. The trail wasn't particularly popular, which was part of its appeal. It was labeled as moderate to difficult, with a mix of steep inclines, rocky scrambles, and some dense forest sections. Reviews online had mentioned stunning views from the summit and a quiet, untouched feeling to the whole area. That's exactly what I was looking for: a challenge and some solitude. I packed my gear carefully the night before. Sturdy boots, extra socks, layers for warmth, plenty of water, energy bars, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, and a map of the trail. I even double-checked my GPS and compass, though I prided myself on my sense of direction. My plan was to hike up to the summit, camp overnight, and return the next morning. It seemed straightforward enough. I set out early the next day, my car loaded with gear and my spirits high. The drive itself was beautiful, winding roads through fiery autumn foliage, with golden leaves catching the morning sunlight. By the time I reached the trailhead, the air was crisp and cool, perfect for hiking. There were only 2 other cars parked there, which didn't surprise me given the trail's reputation for being remote. I strapped on my backpack, adjusted my boots, and started up the trail. The first couple of miles were uneventful. The path was well marked, with occasional signs pointing toward the summit. I passed through a stretch of hardwood forest, the leaves crunching underfoot and the sunlight filtering through the canopy. Birds chirped in the distance, and the rhythmic sound of my footsteps was almost meditative. The trail became steeper as I climbed higher. Loose rocks and exposed roots made me focus on every step, but I was used to that. I paused occasionally to catch my breath, drink some water, or admire the view when the trees opened up. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a flat section where the trail leveled out for a while, cutting through a dense thicket of spruce trees. The air felt cooler here, and the smell of the evergreens was almost overpowering. It was somewhere in this stretch that I first noticed the tracks. At first, I thought they were just deer prints, but as I crouched down to take a closer look, I realized they were too large and had claw marks. Bear tracks. They didn't look fresh, but they were a stark reminder that I wasn't the only one out here. I made a mental note to stay alert and moved on. The climb became more challenging after that. The trail narrowed, and at times I had to use my hands to scramble up rocky sections. I passed a small stream where I refilled my water bottle using a portable filter. The cold water was refreshing, and I took a moment to sit on a boulder and snack on an energy bar. The quiet was almost unsettling here. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint trickle of the stream. By the time I reached the summit, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. The view was everything I had hoped for. Rolling hills stretched out in every direction, their colors softened by the golden light. In the distance, I could see the faint outline of more mountains, their peaks shrouded in mist. I set up my tent in a small clearing just below the summit, where the trees offered some shelter from the wind. After securing my gear, I cooked a quick dinner on my portable stove and settled in for the night. It was colder than I had anticipated. I bundled up in my sleeping bag, but the chill seemed to seep through the tent walls. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up suddenly to the sound of something moving outside. My first thought was the bear tracks I'd seen earlier. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound was faint, just a rustling of leaves, but it was enough to make my heart race. I told myself it was probably just the wind or a small animal and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I packed up camp and began the descent. My legs were sore from the climb, but the downhill trek was easier and I made good time. The weather was perfect, clear skies and cool air, and I felt a sense of accomplishment as I retraced my steps. That feeling didn't last long. About halfway down the trail, I noticed something odd. A pile of rocks that hadn't been there the day before now blocked part of the path. It wasn't a landslide. It looked deliberate, almost like someone had stacked them. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe another hiker had done it as a marker or for some other reason I didn't understand. I stepped around the pile and continued on. But then I saw another one, about 100 yards further down the trail, and another. Each pile was about knee-high with the rocks carefully balanced. They seemed to line the path one after the other, leading me down the trail. The logical part of my brain told me it was just someone having fun or leaving a trail marker, but a nagging feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. As I descended further, the piles became more frequent, some spaced just a few feet apart. I started to feel uneasy. The forest, which had felt so peaceful the day before, now seemed oppressive. The trees were too quiet, and the faint rustle of leaves felt like it was following me. I picked up my pace, no longer enjoying the hike but focused on getting back to my car. That's when I found the campsite. It was just off the trail, tucked into a small clearing. The remains of a fire pit, a torn tent, and scattered gear told me someone had camped here recently. But the tent looked slashed, not just torn by the wind or animals. A backpack lay open, its contents strewn across the ground. I hesitated, unsure whether to investigate or keep moving. Curiosity won out and I stepped closer. The gear looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. A water bottle lay on its side, still half full. A pair of boots sat neatly by the tent, as if the person had intended to put them on and leave but never got the chance. My stomach turned as I noticed deep gouges in the ground, like something heavy had been dragged away. There was no blood, no obvious signs of a struggle, but the scene felt wrong in every possible way. I didn't stick around to figure out what had happened. Every instinct told me to get out of there, fast. I practically ran the rest of the way down the trail, ignoring the piles of rocks and the eerie silence of the forest. By the time I reached the trailhead, my legs were shaking, and my breath came in ragged gasps. My car was still there, and so were the other two vehicles. I climbed in, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was back home, sitting in the safety of my apartment, that I allowed myself to process what had happened. I couldn't shake the image of that campsite or the strange piles of rocks. I searched online for reports of missing hikers or strange occurrences in the area but found nothing. To this day, I don't know what I stumbled upon in those woods, but I've never gone hiking alone again. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still see those rocks, perfectly stacked, leading me into the unknown. I've always loved hiking. It's something I've done for years, both back in Vermont and here in Switzerland. The feeling of fresh mountain air, the solitude, and the sense of freedom always drew me in. But this time, something was different. It was just me, my backpack, and the trail. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, nothing extreme. I had a map, a compass, and enough water and snacks to last me the whole day. The trail I was on was part of a network of routes that wound through thick forests and rocky outcrops, leading up to a ridge with stunning views. I'd hiked parts of it before, but I'd never gone all the way through. I didn't expect any surprises today, just a peaceful walk through nature. But as I took my first few steps onto the trail, there was a weird feeling in the air. It was as if something had shifted, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I shrugged it off. Probably just my nerves from being alone, I thought. The woods around me were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves as a breeze passed through. The trees were tall, with thick trunks and dense canopies that blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving the path in a soft, greenish twilight. I kept walking, my boots crunching softly on the gravel trail. It was a well-trodden path, so I didn't have to worry about getting lost. As I continued deeper into the forest, I noticed the usual sounds of nature started to fade. The birds that normally filled the air with song were gone. No rustling of animals in the underbrush. The silence was almost oppressive. I could feel the weight of it pressing on me. A few miles in, I came to a fork in the path. The map I had showed two options. One led to a viewpoint, the other to a small lake I'd heard was peaceful and secluded. I'd been to the viewpoint before, so I decided to take the path toward the lake. I figured it would be a nice spot to relax for a bit. The path became narrower and less distinct as I went, but I didn't mind. It was more remote, and that suited me just fine. I liked being away from the crowds. As I walked, the trees grew denser, and the air felt cooler. There was something about the quiet of the place that made my skin crawl. But again, I brushed it off as just my imagination. Nothing strange had happened yet. It was around midday when I started to notice something off. The sun was high enough to peek through the gaps in the trees, casting slanted rays of light across the ground. But in some places, it felt like the light was being swallowed up by the shadows. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual, though I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I kept walking, the lake still a good ways off. The path started to rise, and I had to be more careful with my footing. The rocks were slippery, and the trail had begun to twist and turn more sharply. I paused to catch my breath, leaning against a large stone. The air smelled earthy, damp from the recent rain. I took a sip from my water bottle, trying to calm my nerves, but the silence was unnerving, felt too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was at that moment that I heard something, a soft crunch of leaves, like someone walking behind me. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, but the trail was empty. I was alone. The only movement I could see was the sway of the trees in the wind. I laughed it off nervously, thinking maybe it was just an animal. But still, I couldn't help the uneasy feeling creeping over me. I kept moving, faster now, trying to shake the anxiety that had settled in my chest. I needed to get to the lake, I told myself. It was just a feeling. Nothing was wrong. But the further I went, the more I started to feel the weight of being alone in the woods. The feeling of being watched never left. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I came to the lake. It was beautiful. The water was still, reflecting the trees and the sky in perfect symmetry. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease. The feeling of being alone in the forest was still there, but here, by the water, it felt slightly more peaceful. I sat down on a rock near the edge, unpacking my snacks and letting my mind wander. But I couldn't relax for long. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger, more intense. I checked my watch. It was late afternoon now. I needed to start heading back to the trailhead before it got dark. But the path back seemed longer now. The trees, darker. The air, colder. I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone anymore. I hurried back toward the main trail, but the woods felt different. The shadows seemed longer, stretching out in strange ways. I quickened my pace, my breathing coming faster, but no matter how quickly I walked, the feeling of being followed stayed with me. The path was no longer familiar. The turns were sharper, the trees more twisted. I tried to pull out my map, but I realized I hadn't taken it with me when I left the lake. Panic started to creep in. I had no idea where I was anymore, and that's when I saw it, tracks. Fresh ones right on the trail. Large, heavy footprints like someone or something had been following me. I knelt down, studying them. The ground was soft, and I could see the impression of each step clearly. They weren't animal tracks. The shape was too deliberate. Human tracks. A shiver ran down my spine. My mind raced. Who else would be out here? And why hadn't I heard them? I stood up quickly, my legs trembling. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I wasn't alone. There was someone out there, and they had been following me. The path ahead curved sharply, disappearing into the trees. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward. My only goal now was to get back to the trailhead as quickly as possible. But as I walked, the feeling of being hunted only grew stronger. Every step seemed to take me further into unfamiliar terrain, the shadows growing deeper with each passing minute. My heart was racing now. I kept glancing behind me, but there was nothing. The forest was still, unnaturally still. I felt like I was walking in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. I needed to find my way out. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. I couldn't afford to wait any longer. And then I saw it, the trailhead. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking or how far off course I'd gone. But there it was, the sign at the end of the trail, barely visible through the trees. I broke into a run, not caring how tired I was, how much my legs ached. I just needed to get out of the forest. When I finally reached the parking lot, I couldn't believe it. I was out. I was safe. I sat down on the first rock I could find, breathing hard, my hands shaking. My backpack felt heavier than ever, the weight of the hike finally hitting me. I had made it, and yet I knew something wasn't right. As I looked back at the darkening forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had made it out. That night, back at my cabin, I slept with the door locked. The silence of the woods still haunted me, but I was safe. The trail was behind me, and I had made it home. But something stayed with me. It wasn't a ghost or some supernatural force. It was the feeling that I had been watched the entire time. That someone or something had been waiting for me to let my guard down. The plan seemed simple enough, an overnight hike to a remote lake nestled deep in the forest. I'd done similar hikes before and always enjoyed the solitude and the sense of accomplishment that came with finding places few people ever visit. The maps showed it was about 15 miles each way, with a steady climb through dense forest and an eventual descent into a rocky basin. I figured I'd take my time, camp by the lake, and head back the next day. I packed light: a small tent, some freeze-dried meals, a water filter, and a first aid kit. I debated bringing a satellite phone but decided against it. I had my smartphone and I figured I'd have signal at least part of the way. Plus, I was confident in my ability to handle myself in the wilderness. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from my place. I got there mid-morning, parked the car in a nearly empty lot, and set out. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves. I felt good, energized by the promise of adventure and the peace of being far from the chaos of everyday life. The trail started off easy, a wide, well-marked path that wound through tall pines and occasional clearings. About 5 miles in, the trail narrowed and became steeper. The map had warned about this, and I welcomed the challenge. I took my time, stopping now and then to catch my breath and drink water. Around noon, I reached a fork in the trail. The main path veered left, but a narrower, less obvious trail branched off to the right. According to my map, the right trail was a shortcut that rejoined the main trail about 3 miles ahead. It would save me some time, and it looked like it might be more scenic. The shortcut started off well enough. It was a bit overgrown, but it was easy to follow. The trees grew closer together here, and the underbrush was thick. I noticed there were fewer signs of human activity, no footprints, no litter, no trail markers. It felt like I was stepping into a wilder, untouched part of the forest. About a mile in, the trail started to disappear. At first, I thought I just lost track of it, but as I pushed forward, it became clear that the path had been reclaimed by the forest. I hesitated, debating whether to turn back, but the map suggested I was close to where the shortcut rejoined the main trail. It didn't make sense to backtrack when I was so close. I pushed on, using my trekking poles to steady myself as I navigated over roots and rocks. The forest seemed quieter here, the air heavy and still. I tried to shake off a growing sense of unease. It was just the isolation getting to me, I told myself. By mid-afternoon, I realized I was in trouble. The shortcut had completely disappeared, and no matter how far I went, I couldn't find the main trail. I pulled out my map and compass and tried to orient myself, but nothing matched up. The trees were so dense that I couldn't see any landmarks. My phone had no signal, and the GPS wasn't working. I decided to backtrack, but even that proved difficult. The forest all looked the same, and I quickly lost track of where I'd come from. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'd been in tough situations before and always found my way out. I stopped to eat and drink, hoping the break would clear my head. As I sat there, the sun dipped lower in the sky. The shadows grew longer, and the forest took on an eerie quality. I knew I needed to find a place to set up camp before it got dark. I found a relatively flat spot under a large tree and pitched my tent. I gathered some sticks for a small fire, hoping it would keep me warm and boost my morale. As the flames crackled, I studied the map again, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. The night was long and restless. Every rustle in the bushes set my nerves on edge. I knew it was probably just small animals, but in the darkness, my imagination ran wild. I barely slept, and when dawn finally came, I felt groggy and disoriented. I decided to keep moving, hoping to stumble across the main trail or some sign of civilization. The forest seemed endless, a maze of trees and underbrush. Hours turned into a full day, and still, I found nothing. I rationed my food and water, knowing I had to make it last. By the third day, I was exhausted. My legs ached, and my spirits were low. I started to question every decision I'd made. Taking the shortcut, continuing forward instead of turning back, even coming on this hike in the first place. It wasn't until the fourth day that I finally found something. A creek. The sight of running water gave me hope. I followed it downstream, reasoning that it might lead to a larger river or even a road. The terrain was rough, but the sound of the water kept me going. Late that afternoon, I spotted something that made my heart leap: a bridge. It was old and rickety, but it was proof that people had been here. I crossed it carefully, and on the other side, I found an overgrown path that led to an abandoned cabin. The cabin was small and falling apart, but it offered shelter. Inside, I found a rusty wood stove, a broken chair, and a few empty cans. There was no sign of recent activity, but it felt like a safe place to rest. I stayed there for 2 nights, regaining my strength and trying to decide my next move. On the second day, I heard the distant sound of an engine. I ran outside and followed the noise, stumbling onto a dirt road. A passing truck stopped when the driver saw me. He looked as shocked as I felt. I told him I was lost, and he offered to take me to the nearest town. As we drove, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I'd made it out. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. One wrong decision after another could have ended differently. I learned a lot about myself on that hike. My limits, my resilience, and the importance of respecting the wilderness. I still love hiking, but now I'm a lot more cautious. It started as a simple plan, a weekend solo hike through a trail I'd read about online. The route was a lesser-known section of the Alps, one that promised solitude, fresh air, and stunning views. I had recently moved to Switzerland and was eager to explore more of the region. My research had shown that this particular trail wasn't overly technical, but it was remote enough that I'd need to carry all my supplies. I thought I was prepared. I spent days fine-tuning my pack, making sure I had enough food, water purification tablets, a lightweight tent, and all the essentials. I double-checked my maps and downloaded the area onto my GPS. The weather forecast showed clear skies, and the thought of a quiet weekend surrounded by towering peaks sounded perfect. I left early Saturday morning, parking my car near the small village where the trailhead began. The first few hours were everything I'd hoped for: dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, crisp mountain air, and the kind of peace you can only find miles away from civilization. The trail was well marked at first, winding through dense forest before opening up into a grassy meadow. In the distance, I could see the jagged peaks of the mountains I was aiming for. By midday, I was well into the climb. The forest had thinned out, replaced by rocky paths and patches of snow that hadn't melted yet. The trail was steeper than I'd expected, and I stopped frequently to catch my breath and admire the view. Occasionally, I'd spot a lone marmot or hear the distant call of an eagle. As I climbed higher, the trail became less distinct. There were markers every now and then, small cairns of stacked stones or faded blazes painted on rocks, but they were spaced farther apart. I kept my eyes on the GPS and pressed on, eager to reach the ridge where I planned to set up camp. The thought of sleeping under a star-filled sky kept me moving. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I realized I'd underestimated how exposed this section of the trail would be. The ridge was closer now, but the path had disappeared entirely. I had to rely on the GPS and my instincts, carefully picking my way through loose rocks and uneven ground. I was so focused on the trail that I didn't notice the clouds rolling in until it was too late. A sudden gust of wind nearly knocked me off my feet, and I looked up to see the sky darkening rapidly. The forecast hadn't mentioned any storms, but mountain weather is notoriously unpredictable. I debated whether to push on or turn back, but the thought of losing the progress I'd made was frustrating. I decided to press forward, hoping to find a sheltered spot to set up my tent. The first drops of rain hit as I reached the ridge. The view was breathtaking. Even in the stormy light, miles of untouched wilderness stretching in every direction. But the wind was relentless, and the rain quickly turned to sleet. I hurried to find a flat spot, eventually settling on a small ledge partially protected by a boulder. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. Setting up the tent in the wind was a battle. My hands were numb by the time I managed to stake it down, and I crawled inside just as the storm hit in full force. The wind howled, and the sleet rattled against the thin fabric of the tent. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and tried to warm up, but the noise and the cold made it hard to relax. I hadn't planned on bad weather, and I felt the first twinges of unease. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. What if the tent blew away? What if I couldn't find my way back in the morning? But I forced myself to stay calm. I faced bad weather before. I just needed to wait it out. The storm lasted all night. The wind didn't let up, and I barely slept. When dawn finally broke, the world outside was unrecognizable. Snow covered the ground, and the trail I'd followed was buried. My GPS still worked, but its battery was low. Another oversight on my part. I decided to pack up quickly and head back down before things got worse. The descent was slow and treacherous. The snow hid loose rocks and slippery patches, and I had to move carefully to avoid a fall. My boots were soaked, and my hands ached from the cold. I tried to stay focused, but the constant tension was exhausting. By mid-morning, I was thoroughly disoriented. The markers I'd relied on were gone, and the GPS was struggling to maintain a signal. Panic started to creep in. I knew I had enough supplies to last another day or two, but the thought of being lost in these conditions was terrifying. I forced myself to stop and assess the situation. I was on a slope with no clear landmarks, and the visibility was poor. I decided to follow the GPS as best I could, hoping it would lead me back to the trail. Hours passed. The terrain became more rugged, and I realized I was no longer on the right path. My GPS battery was critically low, and I knew I needed to conserve it. I tried to retrace my steps, but the snow had erased all evidence of my route. My heart pounded as I realized the gravity of my situation. I found a sheltered spot under an overhang and decided to wait for the weather to improve. I rationed my food and tried to stay warm, but the hours dragged by. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and I knew I couldn't afford to stay put for too long. The next morning, the sky cleared just enough for me to see the outline of a valley below. It looked like my best chance, so I packed up and started the descent. The snow was deeper here, and every step was a struggle. My legs burned with effort, and I slipped more times than I could count. By midday, I reached the valley floor, but it was nothing like I'd expected. The landscape was barren and featureless, with no signs of a trail. I felt a wave of despair, but I forced myself to keep moving. I followed a small stream, hoping it would lead to a larger body of water, and eventually civilization. The hours blurred together. My supplies were running low, and the cold sapped my strength. I started to feel lightheaded and had to stop frequently to rest. Every noise, every crack of ice or rustle of wind, set my nerves on edge. I was completely alone, and the weight of that realization was crushing. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I spotted a faint outline in the distance. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, I saw it was a small wooden cabin. It looked abandoned, but at that moment, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The door was unlocked, and I stumbled inside, grateful for the shelter. The cabin was empty, with a simple wooden table, a few chairs, and a fireplace. I found a pile of firewood in the corner and managed to start a small fire. The warmth was a relief, and I collapsed onto the floor, too exhausted to do anything else. That night, I slept for the first time in days. When I woke, the storm had passed, and the sky was clear. I found a map on the table that showed the surrounding area, and to my relief, the cabin was marked as a ranger station. A marked trail wasn't far, and by midday, I was back on track. Reaching the safety of my car felt like a miracle. The weekend had tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated, but I'd made it through. As I drove back to the village, I promised myself I'd be better prepared next time. The mountains were beautiful, but they didn't forgive carelessness. It was a crisp autumn morning when I decided to go hiking alone. The mountains near my small town in Vermont always seemed to call my name during this season. The trails were quieter, the air was sharper, and the leaves painted the landscape with shades of red, orange, and gold. I packed a small backpack with the essentials: water, a couple of granola bars, a map, my phone, and a lightweight jacket. I wasn't planning to be gone long, just a few hours. I chose a trail I'd hiked once before, years ago. It wasn't the most popular route, but that was part of the appeal. The path was moderately challenging, with enough twists, turns, and elevation changes to make it interesting. I remembered there being a gorgeous overlook about 3 miles in, where the forest opened up to reveal a view of the valley below. That was my destination. The first mile was easy. The trailhead was well marked, and the ground was packed dirt with a thin layer of fallen leaves. I moved steadily, my boots crunching with each step. The trees were tall and dense, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft beams. I felt at peace, enjoying the solitude and the rhythmic sound of my footsteps. As I continued, the trail became narrower, and the forest grew thicker. I had to duck under low-hanging branches and step over roots that jutted out like gnarled fingers. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, a scent that always reminded me of childhood hikes with my dad. I paused briefly to take a sip of water and look around. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of human activity, just silence. About 2 miles in, I noticed the trail starting to fade. The markers, small blazes painted on tree trunks, were spaced farther apart, and some were faded to the point of being almost invisible. I slowed my pace, scanning the trees ahead for the next marker before moving forward. It was frustrating at times, but I wasn't too concerned. I had my map and a good sense of direction. At one point, I reached a fork in the trail that wasn't marked on my map. Both paths looked equally worn, and I couldn't see any markers indicating which way to go. I hesitated, trying to recall if I'd encountered this fork the last time I hiked this trail. Nothing came to mind. After a few minutes of deliberation, I chose the left path. Felt like the right choice, even if I couldn't explain why. The trail grew steeper, winding its way up the side of a hill. My legs began to burn, but I welcomed the challenge. I kept telling myself the overlook wasn't far now. But as I climbed higher, the path became even harder to follow. Fallen leaves obscured the ground, and the trees looked almost identical, making it easy to lose my bearings. I stopped frequently to check my map, but the lack of markers made it difficult to confirm if I was on the right track. By the time I realized I might have taken the wrong path, I was already deep into the forest. Turning back seemed like an option, but I didn't want to admit defeat just yet. I figured the trail had to connect to the main route eventually. It was a loop after all, or so I thought. The hill leveled out into a flat, rocky area. The ground was uneven, covered in moss and patches of brittle grass. I noticed a small cairn, a stack of stones, off to the side of the trail. It wasn't an official marker, but it seemed like a sign that someone had passed through here before. Encouraged, I pressed on. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The trees were older here, their trunks thick and their bark rough. The undergrowth was sparse, replaced by a blanket of moss that muffled my footsteps. The air felt heavier, cooler. I glanced at my phone to check the time. It was just afternoon, but the dense canopy made it feel much later. I realized I hadn't seen a single trail marker in over an hour. My unease grew. I stopped to eat a granola bar and reassess my situation. The map wasn't much help anymore. I couldn't pinpoint my location, and the lack of landmarks made it hard to orient myself. I debated turning back, but the thought of retracing my steps through the maze of unmarked paths was daunting. Instead, I decided to keep moving forward, hoping to find a clearer trail or some sign of the overlook. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed small changes that made me uneasy. The silence, which I'd initially found calming, now felt oppressive. The forest seemed too still, as if even the wind was holding its breath. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. At one point, I stumbled across an old fire pit. It was nothing more than a circle of blackened stones, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. Nearby, I found the remnants of a makeshift shelter. A few broken branches leaned against a tree, covered with tattered strips of fabric. The sight sent a chill down my spine. Who had built it, and why had they abandoned it? I pushed forward, my pace quickening despite the growing fatigue in my legs. The trail was barely visible now, just a faint indentation in the mossy ground. My focus narrowed to the path ahead, each step driven by the hope that I was close to finding my way out. But the forest seemed endless, each turn revealing more of the same. Trees, rocks, and shadows. Then I heard it, a faint sound, distant but distinct. It wasn't the wind or the creak of a tree branch. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps? My heart raced as I strained to listen, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an animal or even my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept moving, forcing myself to stay calm. My water bottle was nearly empty, and the shadows were growing longer. The realization hit me hard. I was lost, truly lost. I had no idea where I was or how to get back to the trailhead. Panic threatened to take over, but I knew I couldn't afford to lose my head. I needed to focus, to think clearly. I decided to climb a nearby hill to get a better view of my surroundings. The ascent was grueling, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. When I finally reached the top, I scanned the horizon. Trees stretched as far as the eye could see, an unbroken sea of green and gold. In the distance, I thought I saw a faint glimmer of water, a lake or river, perhaps. It wasn't much, but it was a direction. Descending the hill was harder than climbing it. The slope was steep, and the ground was slippery with loose dirt and leaves. I fell twice, scraping my hands and knees. By the time I reached the bottom, the light was fading fast. The thought of spending the night in the forest filled me with dread, but I had no choice. I needed to find shelter before it got too dark to see. I found a small clearing and gathered what I could to make a crude shelter. Branches, leaves, and my jacket provided minimal protection from the cold. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound, every rustle, crack, or distant call set my nerves on edge. I kept the small knife from my backpack in my hand, though I doubted it would be much help if something or someone approached. The next morning, I set out toward the water I'd seen from the hill. My legs ached, and my throat was dry, but I forced myself to keep moving. Hours passed, and the forest began to change again. The trees thinned out, and the ground grew softer, damp with moisture. I finally emerged onto the banks of a wide, slow-moving river. Relief washed over me. Water meant civilization wasn't far. I followed the river downstream, and after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a dirt road. It was little more than a track, but it was enough. I knew if I followed it, it would eventually lead to a main road or a house. Sure enough, after another hour of walking, I saw a small cabin in the distance. Smoke rose from its chimney, and the sight filled me with an overwhelming sense of relief. The man who lived there was kind, though he seemed surprised to see me. He gave me water and let me use his phone to call for help. When the search and rescue team arrived, they told me I'd wandered miles off the trail, deep into an area rarely visited by hikers. They were impressed I'd managed to find my way out. Looking back, I can't explain everything I experienced in that forest. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe the isolation heightened my senses in ways I didn't understand. But one thing is certain: I'll never hike alone again. I never planned for it to be a scary hike. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape. Just me, the mountains, and the trees. A chance to clear my head and maybe take some photos of the scenery. I had done this trail before, several times actually, and I had always enjoyed it. But this time, something felt different. It was early morning when I set out, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The air was cool and crisp, just the way I liked it when I hiked. I could feel the ground firm beneath my boots as I moved along the narrow trail, winding through dense forest. The trees around me were tall, their thick trunks covered in layers of moss and their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sky. I was used to the quiet of the forest, just the sounds of birds, the wind rustling through leaves, and the occasional snap of twigs beneath my feet. But today, that quiet felt different. It felt heavier, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I pushed the thought aside. It was probably just my imagination. I had been feeling a little off lately, stressed, anxious. The usual work pressures were starting to get to me, and I thought a solo hike would do the trick. Clear my mind, get away from everything. The trail was easy at first, gently sloping upward as I made my way deeper into the forest. The air grew a little cooler as I climbed, and the sounds of the world seemed to fade more with every step I took. I took in the familiar smells of pine and earth, and I felt my body relax. But as I moved further along, I began to notice something strange. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the wind, a slight change in the sounds of the forest. The birds that had been singing so cheerfully before were now quiet. The breeze felt colder, sharper, as if it was coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. I stopped for a moment, pulling out my water bottle and taking a sip. The quiet felt unsettling now, and I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. It was one of those moments when you start to question whether it's all in your head or if there's something more to it. I shrugged off the feeling. There was no reason to worry. I had hiked these woods countless times before, but then I heard it, a faint rustling behind me, just off the trail. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a squirrel or a deer, but the sound was too deliberate, too close, as if something or someone was following me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. The trail behind me was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't sure what it was, but something had changed. The peaceful hike I had envisioned was slipping away, replaced by a feeling of unease. I continued walking, trying to shake off the discomfort, but it only seemed to grow with every step. The further I went, the thicker the trees became. The trail narrowed, the brush on either side getting denser. It felt like the forest was closing in on me, and I couldn't help but feel a strange pull to go deeper, to keep moving forward. That's when I heard it again. The rustling, closer this time, louder. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart began to race as my eyes scanned the woods. I couldn't see anything. No movement, no signs of life. Just the trees and the path ahead. But the feeling was unmistakable. Something was there. I forced myself to keep walking, each step feeling heavier than the last. My breath quickened, my senses on high alert. I couldn't explain it, but I had to get out of there. Something about the woods had changed, and I needed to leave. The trail was supposed to loop back to the parking lot, but now it felt like it was stretching on forever, leading me deeper into the unknown. The sound of the rustling grew louder, and I broke into a jog, hoping to outrun whatever was following me. But no matter how fast I went, it seemed to be right behind me, just out of sight. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. It had to be an animal, right? A deer or a bear, maybe, but the footsteps sounded too deliberate, too human. My feet slipped on a loose patch of dirt, and I stumbled, catching myself just before I fell. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I realized I was completely out of breath. The forest was darker now, the trees crowding in around me as I pushed forward. And then, as if the woods themselves were conspiring against me, I lost the trail. 1 minute, I was following the well-worn path, and the next, I was standing in a thick tangle of underbrush, with no sign of the trail behind me. Panic shot through me like a bolt of lightning. How had I lost the trail? I'd been on this hike dozens of times. This wasn't possible. I turned around in a circle, hoping to spot a marker or something familiar. But the forest was like a maze now, the trees towering above me and the underbrush thick with tangled vines. I felt completely disoriented, and the eerie quiet seemed to press down on me from all sides. And then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, closer this time. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I wasn't alone. Whoever or whatever had been following me was right there, just behind the trees. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I turned and bolted, pushing through the thick underbrush, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't care where I was going anymore, just as long as I was moving. The woods seemed endless, the trees pressing in on me from all sides. I could hear the rustling growing louder again, and my panic deepened. Was I going in circles? Was I being hunted? I stumbled through the woods for what felt like hours, the sunlight barely breaking through the thick canopy above. My legs were burning, my breath ragged, but I kept running, terrified of what might be gaining on me. Finally, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw a break in the trees ahead, a clearing. My heart surged with hope, and I pushed forward, my legs screaming in protest. And then, just like that, I was out of the forest. The trees parted, and I stumbled into a wide, open space, an old meadow I didn't recognize. The air felt lighter here, and I could finally breathe. I stopped, panting, and turned around. The forest loomed behind me, dark and silent, but there was no sign of anything following me anymore, just the soft rustling of the wind through the grass. I stood there for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart. The sun was higher in the sky now, and I could feel the warmth on my skin. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt safe. But something still gnawed at me. Something didn't add up. I had no idea how I had ended up in the meadow. I didn't remember seeing it on my way up. Had I wandered off the trail somehow? Or had something pulled me off course? I didn't know, and at that moment I didn't care. All I wanted was to get back to the parking lot and leave that forest behind. I turned and started walking, my steps slow and cautious as I made my way toward the edge of the meadow. The trail should have been just beyond the trees on the other side. As I walked, the thought kept creeping into my mind. Was I just imagining things? Had I really been followed? Or had it all been some kind of anxiety-fueled panic attack? But then I reached the edge of the meadow, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. A set of footprints, leading away from the meadow and back into the woods. The prints were fresh, barely an hour old, maybe, and they were the unmistakable marks of boots, the same kind I was wearing. I froze, staring at the prints. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up once again. I wasn't alone. Not before. Not now. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find a trace of anyone. The feeling of being followed, of something lurking just behind me, was still there, but it had faded, replaced by the heavy weight of confusion and dread. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I turned and walked out of the meadow, back into the trail, and towards the parking lot. This time, I didn't look back.